Again.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Once again, it just wouldn't be a podcast without all kinds of strange things happening. Couldn't get my Nicecast to work. Then I couldn't get Archives to work. I had to jump back and forth between the two, and, well, finally got things working. We're going to be talking about the Edinburg UFO Conference that just happened last weekend, which would have been April 5th and 6th. First, a Thursday night, I ran into a bit of a problem. I wanted to watch Josh Gates' new season of Expedition Unknown. I like his shows. They're entertaining and informative, and he gets to fall down a lot and eat something and then get sick. Well, I guess he mostly did that on Destination Truth, but he does do some rather strange things, and I wonder how much money his wife must have on him for insurance, but oh well. The guy seems to be trying to kill himself, but I liked the show. However, In Search of Monsters was on the Travel Channel at the same time. I don't have one of those recording thingies on my cable box. So I watched my friends look for the Loch Ness Monster. Ken Gerhardt and Nick Redfern were both on In Search of Monsters. I guess I'll have to catch Josh at another time. Yeah, they repeat that show all the time, so I'll catch it someday. In Edinburg, we didn't have just the UFO Conference. We had the open mic night, we had the festival, and we had the conference. Well, during the festival, I met a man who told me about a headless ghost sighting. I remember just about the entire story, but I was unable to get the man's name. If this was you, and you're willing to let me tell the story, send me a note at strangethings@arkanasa.com and just mention where the incident took place. That way I'll know it's really you. That way I'll tell the story on the show next week. If you were not at the Edinburg UFO get-together, you missed the best UFO conference ever. If you were there, you'll know what I mean. If you weren't, well, I feel sorry for you. I took the RV down, and I stayed for 3 nights, so I could attend the open mic night, the festival, and the conference. My wife was unable to go since she had to stay and teach school. I tried to get her to call in sick, but, well, she never does that. She only gets sick on the weekends or, like, during spring break. Edinburg, Texas is only 150 miles from Laredo. The South Texas Bigfoot Conference is going on Saturday the 13th. My wife keeps telling me I should go, but it's a 400-mile drive north from Houston, and I hate driving to that town no matter what. Only if the other choice is Austin. Houston is 3 times as big as Austin, but Austin has worse traffic. So if I did drive up to Huntsville and had to go through Houston, I'd wind up saying or doing something that would cost me money and maybe time in jail. Now, that's my wife's job, and keep me from losing my mind in traffic. Last year I did say a few things not very nice about the traffic in Houston, and my wife patted me on the head and said, there, you'll be okay. So if you're at the South Texas Bigfoot Conference and you see me there, you might just ask how many tickets I got on the way up there. And to think, I learned how to drive going in and out of Houston. The festival and conference in Edinburg doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of planning. Noe Torres told me they start planning for the next conference as soon as the current conference finishes. They work on it all year long, coming up with ideas on how to make it better each year. I'd say they're getting better each year from what I've seen. The entire library staff takes part in the planning. They also get a lot of support from other city staff. The conference speakers are scheduled and booked by February, so there's none of that last-minute confusion. It takes about 30 people working year-round, using any spare time they have to make the Edinburg UFO Conference a success. I'm already looking forward to 2020. I wonder who will be on stage. Make plans to attend April 2020 at Edinburg, Texas. The folks involved in putting the show together, I'd like to just mention them because you don't hear their names very often, even if you're at the conference. Noe Torres is the originator of the conference. He's one of the planners, consultant, and he's the MC. Letty Leha is the conference director, and she's the director of the public library. Magdiel Alonso Castil is the cultural arts director. He's the guy I always run into when I'm trying to get set up, so he can tell me which table I'm supposed to be at, and he hands out the name tags usually. Soledad Nunez is the art coordinator. This year, Daniel Allen Jones stepped in and helped out when he was needed due to some unexpected last-minute problems that came up. I took the RV down and stayed for 3 nights so I could attend the entire conference, and the place I stayed at was pretty nice. I'd much rather pay $50 a night to stay at an RV park than $110 to stay in a hotel that never feels as comfortable as you'd expect. I always try to get an RV site close to the action so I don't have to drive back and forth. We made the mistake of staying in Mission last year. It was a bit of a drive to the festival and the conference. I just wish there was an RV park right next door to one of the sites. It would really be nice. Say right across the street from City Hall, or just right up the road from the Renaissance where the conference is held. A Thursday evening, we got together at the Edinburg Auditorium. It's an old building right behind City Hall. The auditorium was built in 1938, and it was a part of the Works Progress Administration. So the stonework looks just like the wall around Fort McIntosh or just about any of the state parks here in Texas. The event was an open mic night, so folks could share their experiences. Don Schmidt, Nick Redfern, and Calvin Parker all showed up. They were speakers at the conference. They were on hand to welcome the guests to the show. Unfortunately, Ben Moss, Tony Angiola from Hangar 1 were held up due to weather, as well as Colonel Charles Halt. Their flights were all being held up by snow in the north, which I find amazing because It was 105 degrees here in Laredo Wednesday. Javier Gonzalez from McAllen was on stage to tell the audience about his encounter with a UFO while he and his brother were traveling from San Antonio to McAllen, 1968. They both experienced missing time, and this led to them believing they had been abducted. Joe Ponce is the son of the deputy who began the initial investigation into the Edinburg UFO incident back in 1966. He told about how his dad was called out to the scene, and later he took Joe out to see the destruction. Folks were a bit hesitant to step up to the mic and share their experiences, but by the end of the night there was a line of people wanting to talk. As usual, the folks trying to close up had to chase me out the door since I was still there talking to people. I usually tend to stay past my welcome. Folks want to talk, I want to listen. I should start taking notes because a lot of what they're telling me I tend to forget before I get a chance to write it down, but, well, that's how I do things. A Friday evening was the UFO Festival, which is held in the courtyard of City Hall. This was a time to relax and enjoy hanging out with like-minded people. Some folks come dressed up like aliens, while others were there as themselves. Maybe the aliens were themselves as well. We had a line of tables offering books on all subjects from science fiction to actual events, fiction and nonfiction. There was food and music. I was given a table right next to Colonel Charles Halt, but I hardly had a chance to speak to him. The crowd was intense, the music was loud, and there were a lot of people all talking and enjoying themselves at the same time, so it was a bit noisy. Some folks had on tin-foil hats. This got me to thinking about the MIT study done. Tin-foil hats actually enhance the effects of beams being sent into your brain. The only way to make a tinfoil hat work is to encase the entire head. It's kind of the idea behind a Faraday cage. Only wrapping the tinfoil around the top of your noggin is only going to make the rays that much more intense. I got back to the RV later than I'd wished, and I had to get ready for the big event the next day. Like I said earlier, I hate staying in hotels. No matter how nice the place is, it just lacks that home feel. By taking my home with me, it was like being at home even though I was 150 miles away. Last year, my wife and I had spent the weekend in Edinburgh at the UFO Festival and Conference, and then the next weekend we drove up to Huntsville to attend the Bigfoot Conference. We put a few miles on the RV, but it felt like we were home the whole time. It's also neat when you get to where you're going, you don't have to unpack anything. You're already home. When it's time to go, you unplug the RV and go. No need to go looking to be sure you don't forget your phone charger or your toothbrush in a bedroom somewhere. A Saturday was the conference. It started at 9 a.m. and it was just too bad for anybody that missed the opening speakers. Ben Moss and Tony Angiola kicked things off talking about the Lonnie Zamora case from April 24th, 1964, which happened on the outskirts of Socorro, New Mexico. Officer Zamora was chasing a speeder out of town when he spotted what looked like an explosion or smoke coming up out in the brush. Knowing there was a dynamite shack out that way, Lonnie drove out to see if there was anything going on. He was driving a brand new police car. He had to go up over a hill that was so steep and so bad shape, he had to take a running start at it, and it took him 3 tries to get up and over the hill. These are the kind of places that when you go there, you need to be in a 4-wheel drive pickup, and not in a 2-wheel drive sedan. Lonnie came upon an egg-shaped UFO sitting in the brush. There were 2 aliens walking around it that, when they spotted him, they looked as startled as he was. The craft took off, and Lonnie had to dive for cover, not knowing what the UFO might do. There were several other witnesses who all confirmed what Officer Zamora said. There were 9 other reports of an egg-shaped craft in the area. J. Allen Hynek showed up to be sure the Air Force didn't screw up the scene. Unlike what you see in the TV show, Hynek seldom traveled to the sites of UFO reports. Most of the work was done over the phone. A report would come in, it would sit on the desk. Mr. Hynek would pick it up and read it, and then make an evaluation from there. None of that running around in the woods and being chased by creatures like in the TV show. They found there were 4 indentations in the dirt where the craft had set down. The naysayers all said there was no way anyone would build a landing craft with 4 legs. Anybody building such a craft would have used the tripod configuration. Then NASA came out with the LEM, which had 4 landing legs on it. The craft was not some NASA experiment. It was not from this Earth as far as anyone could tell. It sounds as if it was from some other planet, and the officials in the Air Force didn't want anybody to know. Some folks said that this was the LEM being tested by NASA, but at that time, that date, the LEM couldn't fly. It had to be lowered and raised by a cable. The craft that Lonnie Zamora saw rose up into the sky. It hovered there for a few seconds, and then it flew away at a tremendous rate, something the LEM was never capable of. I'd heard the Calvin Parker story before, but hearing it from the man who was involved was not only impressive, it was hilarious. Calvin had the whole audience rolling on the floor with his delivery of how he and his boss were abducted by aliens. 1973. Calvin was working in the oil field. I worked in the oil field, and I know what he meant when he said he was looking for a better job. A friend of his dad, Charlie Hickson, was looking for somebody to work in a shipyard as a welder. So Calvin said he knew how to weld in order to get the job. I wonder how long it took for Charlie to realize that Calvin was overstating his abilities. Calvin went to work in Pascagoula, Mississippi. That's when his life changed forever. The 2 men were sitting on a disused pier when they saw a blue light coming from behind them. Naturally, Calvin thought, well, this is the cops. They're here to arrest us for trespassing and anything else that they had done wrong. That's when they saw 3 creatures. Calvin described they looked like robots coming towards them. 2 grabbed Charlie, while 1 grabbed Calvin. The 2 men were then dragged aboard a flying saucer. Inside, Calvin encountered a female alien that he described as being an attractive woman if he'd had a few drinks, but he was sober, so she wasn't very good looking. The female alien telepathically told Calvin she wasn't going to harm him. Then she shoved her fingers into Calvin's mouth and up into his sinus cavity. Calvin said this was quite painful, So in a bid to get her to stop, he tried pounding her head against the wall of the spaceship. The robot came over and grabbed him and proceeded to pound his head against the same wall. I am not doing this story justice. To hear him describe the events was well worth driving to Edinburg. This is nothing like what you would hear watching it on TV or on YouTube. Once the front of Calvin's shirt was covered with both his and her blood, Calvin was floated out the door of the craft, and he was set down on the pier right next to Charlie. Charlie was more worried about Calvin than what had just happened. The night grew dark as the door closed on the flying saucer, and then the ship took off. The two men were left in the dark to wonder what had just happened. They walked back to Calvin's car to discover that all the windows on the side that was facing the craft had been broken out. They drove back to town, talking about what they should or shouldn't do. Later on, Calvin discovered his car was magnetized. Paper clips would stick to the side. Charlie, at the time, thought it would be a good idea to call Lackland Air Force Base and report what had happened, but Calvin didn't want anybody to know what had just happened to them. I don't think it was Lackland Air Force Base, but I believe it was. Well, Charlie proceeded to call the air base, and he was told by the Air Force that they don't look into alien reports anymore, and they advised him to contact the Sheriff's Department. Charlie then called the Sheriff's Department, and then the fun really began. Naturally, the deputy taking the report didn't believe any of it. The men were separated and questioned. Then they were put back into the same room together. The deputies had placed a recorder in the room so they could listen in on anything that was said. They were thinking that Charlie and Calvin would discuss having made the whole thing up, but instead, the conversation was on what they had just been through and how unbelievable the whole thing was. This got the authorities to take the situation a lot more seriously. Calvin had seen astronauts return from the moon on TV, and he was thinking maybe the pair should be quarantined due to them being hazardous to anyone they ran into. Once they were released, Calvin went straight home, got rid of all of his clothing. He scrubbed down and then tried to avoid anyone so he wouldn't accidentally contaminate them. J. Allen Hynek and Dr. Harder both took an immediate interest in this case. They made arrangements to meet with the two men as soon as possible. The next day, Calvin convinced Charlie they should just act natural and not say anything to anyone. They arrived at work to find reporters and curious all over the place. The parking lot was full of people who had heard about the abduction. See, at that time, you didn't use a cell phone to communicate. You just used a telephone. And there weren't that many telephone lines, and so most people were on what was called a party line. I remember this when I was young. You'd pick up the phone and call someone, and once in a while you'd hear somebody else talking in the background, or you'd just hear them lift up the receiver and you'd hear a click over the line. This would let you know that somebody else was on the line. Well, in the small town that Calvin and Charlie were living in, they had a party line, so every time they had called the police or the Sheriff's Department or the Air Force Base, other people had heard the conversation. They reported it to other people. That's how everybody learned what was going on. If this is the first time you've heard of this case, I really am not giving you the full story. The way Calvin told it was far more entertaining. If you get a chance, you should try to go see Calvin Parker speak. He is well worth the drive. Well, at work, their boss told them there was no way any work was going to get done with all of those reporters following them around asking questions. The boss had them speak to an attorney who would put together a press release, hoping to put an end to all of the hubbub. Well, the deputies got to thinking just maybe these two men should be checked for any radioactivity or other hazards, so they sent a car to pick up Charlie and Calvin and take them Code 3 to, it was Kessler Air Force Base. What did I say earlier? They took them to Kessler Air Force Base, which was nearby. Once at the base, the men in hazmat suits came out and they ran Geiger counters over their bodies. They were then questioned by Air Force personnel. As soon as the guys got back to their office, Dr. J. Allen Hynek had arrived and he said he wanted to talk to them. This conversation wound up lasting for 3 days. Dr. Harder tried to hypnotize both Charlie and Calvin to see if he could get any more information out of them. Calvin said the day after the abduction were far worse than the actual event. So having all these reporters and curious people running around was worse than having some female alien stick her fingers into your sinus cavities. Charlie seemed to be enjoying the attention, but Calvin wished everybody would just leave him alone. The press hounded him, trying to get him to talk. If you look at photographs of Calvin and Charlie from the newspapers, you'll notice that Calvin has this look on his face like he really wishes he was somewhere else. It took a few years, but things finally settled down. In 1993, Calvin told his wife he was going fishing and he would be back before sundown. He didn't like being on the river any time after dark. Gee, I wonder why. He got to the river and dropped a line in the water. Then he awoke sitting in his car at 5 a.m. Now, I don't know how much of this was true, but Calvin said that he tried to tell his wife he was having an affair running around with wild women, instead of admitting he may have just been abducted again. He really didn't want to go through all that mess of people asking him questions. This is how Calvin talked the whole time he was at the conference. Entertaining and hilarious. Bud Hopkins had written a book about missing time, and Calvin decided he was going to go see him about his latest adventure. He had to drive for 12 hours to get to Florida and look Bud up. When Bud Hopkins found out who Calvin was, he asked if they could try hypnosis again. Well, Calvin agreed. One stipulation was Calvin would not remember what he said while under hypnosis until the time was right. Calvin went home not knowing what, if anything, he had said. It wasn't until he went to a wake that he began to recall. Someone recognized him and they wanted to talk about the abduction incident. Calvin said this is not the time, since they were there to pay their respects to a recently deceased person. Once he got home, his wife said Calvin should write a book about what had happened so people could read it and then they'd stop bothering him. Calvin agreed only if he could find a ghostwriter, which he figured would never happen, so he thought he would be off the hook. Well, then Calvin was contacted by Philip Mantell, who owned a small publishing company, and he asked Calvin to write a book, and Philip said he would publish it. Well, Calvin began to think maybe he should write a book. He figured he could read a book in a week, he could read a big book in 2 weeks. So how long could it possibly take? Calvin got Philip to agree there would be no changes to what was written, no matter what. Calvin said he thinks now this might have been a mistake. He shut himself away for 2 weeks, and he wrote his story. He then sent it away to Philip to be published. The reason I'm laughing, I have been working on the Fort McIntosh history for 6 months now. I think I'm about half done. But Calvin actually sat down and he wrote a huge book in 2 weeks. True to his word, Philip didn't change anything of what Calvin said. He did add some things with Calvin's permission. See, when Bud Hopkins had hypnotized Calvin, he recorded the session. Philip had the recorded transcribed, and it was added to the book. Calvin never read the transcripts because he said he didn't really want to know. Under hypnosis, Calvin was able to pretty much tell the same story he had told while awake. Calvin never wanted to read the transcript because he really didn't want to know, so he didn't. As Calvin was writing, he was remembering as well. He remembered when he and his brother had been young, they had shared a bedroom. During one night, his brother had said a ghost came into the room and was blowing something into Calvin's ear. It frightened his brother, and Calvin tried to write it off as just being a dream. When you read the transcription from the hypnosis session, you'll get the whole story. Calvin had vision problems after the experience, and he went to see a doctor. The doctor said his eyes were burned, like what happens if you look at a welding arc without using the hood. Philip tried to get Calvin's medical records for the book, but Mississippi had went through a hurricane and the records were destroyed in the storm. Today, Calvin believes there are some good aliens and there are some bad aliens. It's just like humans. Some are okay and some you don't want anything to do with. Other witnesses came forward to say that they had seen this weird flying object over the river the same time that Charlie and Calvin had been abducted. Their descriptions are the same as to what Calvin later drew. Well, Calvin heard about Betty and Barney Hill, and he drove up to see them. Barney had already passed, but Betty let Calvin stay with her for several days as they compared notes on their experiences. Once again, I'm not telling the whole story because I can't tell it the way Calvin did. Also, he did write that book, and I'm reading it right now. It is rather hefty, and it will take me a while to get through it. It's in his own words, and he describes himself as being a Mississippi redneck and not well educated. If you're one of those folks who gets all bent out of shape by a book that isn't grammatically correct or spelled right, this might not be for you. If, on the other hand, you love to know what is going on around us, get a copy of Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, My Story by Calvin Parker. You can get a copy at Amazon.com. As soon as I knew that we were about to take a break, I ran out the door to get to Calvin's table. I was the second one there, and the line formed behind me all the way back into the conference room. Everybody wanted a copy of his book. I got mine, and it's signed. You can catch Calvin Parker being interviewed on several podcasts and videos, so just have a look. You'll enjoy it. Like I said, though, The absolute best way to hear his story is to hear him in person. You also get to ask him questions, and you get to meet the man, and you can get a copy of his book signed. I'm going to take a brief pause here, play a couple of commercials, and drink some coffee, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Every time I listen to those commercials, which I've listened to them all probably a couple hundred times, I think I should redo them, re-record them, come up with some new ones, but that is a lot of work. I'm already putting about 10 hours a week just into research for the show, and by the time I get around to it, I am just too worn out and not really interested in talking on the microphone anymore, so I guess you'll just have to put up with the same old commercials for a while. Maybe once I become independently wealthy and my calendar gets about 20 more days a month on it. The biggest problem I run into during these breaks is folks wanting to talk. Now, like I said earlier, I like to talk to people. I like to hear what they have to say. I'll get a group gathered around my table wanting to see what I have to offer. Several of them want to tell me about various things they've seen, like that headless ghost story. I will try to give everybody time to talk, and then I'll notice the vendors area is empty. Everybody has gone back in to listen to the next speaker. I usually wind up missing a lot of the conference. It's okay, but I really want to hear everything that the speakers have to say. It's a toss-up. Do you listen to the speakers, or do you listen to the people who have some very interesting stories to tell? Well, Nick Redfern was the next speaker. He was on the show back in 2017. Nick talked about alien abductions and the men in black who try to keep a lid on things. Before we call them abductees, they were called contactees. People like George Adamski, who was contacted by aliens that told him the United States should stop making nukes and try to live in peace along with the Russians. Adamski developed a cult-like group of followers that referred to the aliens as Space Brothers. This was in the height of the Cold War. The government was looking for what was called pinkos, which were halfway to being Reds like the Soviets, that were trying to subvert the country. Here's George Adamski telling people the Soviets are not so bad, and we should throw away our bombs and embrace communism. He wrote a book that sold over 100,000 copies as soon as it was on the shelf. J. Edgar Hoover looked at this as a communist plot to overthrow the government. So, government agents began to show up at all of Adamski's gatherings to listen in on what he was saying. There was a second George, George Van Tassel. He said when the aliens contacted him, they would come to discuss politics. He began holding gatherings at a place called Giant Rock in the Mojave Desert. When around 12,000 people showed up to listen to what George had to say, the government men began to take an interest in Van Tassel as well. The FBI accumulated a mass of information on these men. One file was 320 pages long. There was a list of everyone who attended these gatherings. It would be compiled. Anyone on this file would be looked at as a potential hostile Soviet agent. If you joined a UFO group, you'd be on an FBI list for further scrutiny. I'm sure when Project Blue Book was being played out as a UFO investigation, anybody sending in a report was investigated as if they might be involved in criminal activity. Nick talked about how even recently alien abductees are being harassed by men who, well, sometimes women also, who are dressed in black, who show up and they question the subject. They will usually advise the person involved they should stop talking about what happened, usually followed by a threat or two. People have found their mail is being opened, and they're seeing strange cars parked out front of their homes day and night. Now with the advent of email and texts, I'm sure it's made the NSA and the CIA's job easier because they don't have to go through all that bother of opening your mail. They can just look on a computer. The thing about the MIBs is they don't look all that human. Some describe them as looking more like mannequins than people. They have pale skin, and they act as if they're uncomfortable in their own skin. They also have a curiosity about some everyday items. Back in 1966, when the Mothman was terrorizing Point Pleasant, men in black suits would be seen all over town. One even went to visit Mary Hyre and tell her that she should stop interacting with John Keel. Two men in black tried to grab Mary Hyre's niece. Mothman has been in the news lately up in Chicago. A group of abductees had been having weird dreams. One put the dream down on social media. This was followed by a second and then third. Soon, abductees were all telling similar stories about dreaming of the end of the world in the form of World War III. They all said that the U.S. was rendered helpless by EMP weapons, and then we would be invaded. This got the government's attention. How were all these folks coming up with the same dream? U.S. military intelligence began visiting these abductees and asking questions. I guess somebody figured out that the whole vinegar and honey thing, because none of these folks visited had any bad experiences. The military was there to gain knowledge and not threaten people. Then there are reports of black helicopters that seem to follow or hang around where the abductees are. Nick said he's never met any men in black, but he told about an interesting incident that he was involved in. Nick lives in a 2-story apartment in Arlington, Texas. He was working on the presentation when he heard the sound of a helicopter in the air. It sounded as if it was staying in the area too long, so Nick looked out to see what was up. The helicopter was circling around his apartment building. Then he saw there were 2 of them. They would go around in a gigantic circle that looked as if his unit was the center. Neither of these choppers had any markings. It was still light out, so he could see the 2 aircraft. No visible markings to show who they were or where they were from. Nick has a few books out. It's kind of an inside joke at conferences that he writes a book while traveling to each one. Well, that's how he makes his living. So you should always buy a book or 2 at any conference you attend. This is the best way to get a signed copy, and it helps pay all the expenses of the presenters. Nick has written The Black Diary, MIB Women in Black, Black-Eyed Children, and Dangerous Books. That's all one book, The Black Diary. He's also written Top Secret Alien Abduction Files, What the Government Doesn't Want You to Know, Final Events and the Secret Government Group on Demonic UFOs in the Afterlife. He wrote Area 51, The Revealing Truth of UFOs, Secret Aircraft Cover-Ups and Conspiracies, as well as the Real Men in Black, Evidence, Famous Cases, and True Stories of these mysterious men and their connection to UFO phenomena. This is only a few of his books. He has a lot, and they are all worth reading. You can find most of them at Amazon.com, but really the best way to get his books is to go to a conference and get them right from Ken. That way you can get them signed, and you can usually get your photograph taken with the man as well. He is very friendly and easy to talk to. Another friend of mine, Ken Gerhardt, was at the conference, but he only came as a vendor. He didn't get up on stage. His latest TV show is Hunting Monsters, which is on Thursday nights on the Travel Channel. And Nick Redfern is also on the show as well. Well worth watching. I would have bought some of Ken's books, but I've already bought every book he's got. I've read every book he's got, and I've given his books to other people for birthday and Christmas presents. So Ken had better hurry up and write another book, or I won't be able to buy any more of his books. Unless I make some new friends, and then I need some more birthday presents. It becomes a problem when I've given all my nieces and nephews books for birthdays and Christmas, and then suddenly it's like I don't remember who got which books and how many copies. I'm sure I've already given my nephew the same book twice, but oh well. He can always use them and give them to somebody else as a birthday present. Don Schmidt was up next. He used to work with Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Don talked about the TV show Project Blue Book and how far off the mark the show was. Folks would ask why, if J. Allen Hynek was constantly at odds with the Air Force during investigations, did he stay on with them? Well, Hynek said he wanted to be there when a spacecraft actually landed and the Air Force needed somebody to investigate. He wanted to be on the inside and not on the outside trying to get back in. Donald Edward Kehoe was an American Marine Corps naval aviator who wrote many aviation articles and stories in a variety of leading publications. Kehoe was a major thorn in the side of the military during Project Blue Book. He would try to dig deeper than the military to get to the bottom of UFO stories. To keep him occupied, the Air Force would leak a UFO story to Kehoe on one side of the country, while they were responding to an actual event on the other. This kept Kehoe away from any real good UFO incidents. Had Hynek quit, he would have been running back and forth looking into minor incidents while somebody else got to look into the better cases. Dr. James MacDonald was another thorn, but he was more into Hynek's side. He was always asking why Hynek never released any of the cases he was working on. Well, it's simple. Dr. Hynek had a little something called a security clearance. Anything he read or heard was classified by the military until the military said it was no longer classified. Had Hynek told anyone, he would have been in a lot of hot water. Things like jail time and fines. Don Schmidt talked about something called Project Stork. The Battelle Institute was going to work with Project Blue Book to investigate UFO sightings to see if there was any corollary with weather and time and days of the month and things like that. The government has a weird way of investigating things. They only gave cases to the Battelle scientists that were iffy, to say the least. Here you have an institute filled with scientists ready to go over every scrap of information to get to the bottom of UFO sightings, but the Air Force didn't give them the files to look at. Anytime Hynek was flying to someplace away from the Air Force, the pilots of the plane that saw him would tell all about some of their sightings. They knew better than to file reports and turn it in because this would lead to them flying a desk for the rest of their careers. Now, I have talked to some friends of mine who are pilots, and I've asked them. Some of them will say they saw something, but they don't want to talk about it because they know that that is a career-ending move. In 1952, when Washington was being buzzed by squadrons of UFOs, Captain Ruppelt wanted access to the pilots and the military personnel involved. He was told no way by his other upper echelon commanders. Now think about this a second. Your job is to look into UFO reports. There are reports coming in of UFOs flying all over Washington. And then your boss says you can't talk to anybody involved in the sightings. This led to Ruppelt bailing out of Blue Book. They weren't there to investigate UFOs. They were just there as smoke and mirrors. Ruppelt had said that back in 1947, when the Roswell crash had first come to light, the guys in the Pentagon were all in a panic. They didn't know what was going on or what to do about it. Ruppelt called it a cover-up of ignorance. The Air Force didn't want anybody to know they were not in control of the skies over the United States. In 1953, the CIA had decided that UFO witnesses were more of a danger to U.S. security than the flying saucers. Oddly enough, even though Project Blue Book closed their doors in January of 1970, J. Allen Hynek continued working at Wright-Patterson Air Base in the Foreign Technology Department until 1974. He wasn't working on Soviet airplanes. At the age of 70, Hynek would say he was an old man in a hurry. He was coming to the end of his life and he wanted to know the truth before he went. Unfortunately, those in Washington that are pulling the strings on everything, no matter who we elect, refuse to give him the truth. Don has a few books out as well. Cover-up at Roswell, exposing the 7-year conspiracy to suppress the truth, and Witness to Roswell. When I retired, I was going to sit in a recliner and read all the books I wanted to get to over the years. I was planning to stop working. Now I have the podcast to do each week and try to write a few books. I find I don't have that much time to read half the books I have sitting on the shelf. I do get to read a lot, but it's mostly articles on whatever subject the show is on. Even though J. Allen Hynek was in the movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, his favorite movie was still The Day the Earth Stood Still. Yes, I'm skipping a lot of what was said at the conference. If I was going to give the entire show, there wouldn't be much of a motivation for y'all to come to the next one. Let's say I'm just whetting your appetite for the next year. The last speaker was Colonel Halt. His table was right next to mine, but I hardly got to talk to him. We were both busy talking to folks who had come to see him and maybe buy one of my books. The colonel was impressed by how well run the Edinburg UFO Conference had been. Now, the colonel has been to conferences all over the world, so for him to compliment Edinburg gives you an idea of how great the conference is run. It's not number 3 in the world just because. Noe Torres and the folks who work with him put together a great festival and conference. Colonel Halt talked about how he wound up at Bentwaters in the first place. He was the deputy commander, and it is his job to handle anything the boss didn't want to worry about. Each morning, the colonel would swing by the police station and check on any activity during the previous night. December 26, 1980, the desk sergeant said 3 of his men were out in the woods chasing a UFO. The colonel didn't much like the idea of his men leaving the base because it was not under their authority. The Sergeant Peniston, Airman Kabaznak, and Airman First Class Burroughs were off the base looking into a possible aircraft crash, so this made the situation less problematic. If you have a good excuse for leaving the base, that was okay. It's just the idea of the police officers running around on civilian property that was a problem. The colonel took the report and he headed to his office. Well, that night was the officers' Christmas party, and right in the middle of the festivities, an airman came in to report to the colonel. He said, "It's back. The UFO is back in the woods." Being the deputy commander, it was Colonel Halt's job to take care of anything the boss didn't want to mess with, so the colonel ordered some men to meet him at the back gate. I won't go over the whole story because I'm trying to get with Colonel Halt to come on the show. The detail did go into the woods, and they saw some objects that they could not explain. The men involved wound up being interrogated by men in suits that came up and used drugs and hypnosis to find out what had been seen. Then they threatened everybody to keep their mouths shut. The colonel was never interviewed, nor was he ever debriefed. He wrote out a statement and forwarded it to his general, and then spent weeks wondering if this was the end of his career. Well, after the story broke to the public, one of the airmen who had not really had anything to do with the UFO hunt wrote a book. I just happened to have read this book way back before Bentwaters' UFO incident was being talked about. Well, it turns out that the book was mostly fiction. I have to admit the book had been very hard to believe. The guy that wrote it was having some issues, and I guess he wanted to cash in on other people's work. To get the real story out, Colonel Halt sat down and he wrote his own book. Wow, he wrote a lot. The book is called The Halt Perspective. It is rather substantial, 788 pages. I'll have to wait a bit to get a copy because I already have a stack of books on my desk that I'm trying to read. The book has newspaper clippings, it has photographs, it has a lot of information packed into it. It is not all just one big long story about 3 nights in December. People that have read it say it is well worth reading, and I look forward to getting a copy. I might ask for it for my birthday, but, well, my birthday was last week, so I guess I'll have to wait till Christmas. The Colonel did have one copy of the book sitting on his table. He said he didn't sell books, but he was showing it so that people would know that there was a book out there, in case they wanted it. I had to carry 3 boxes of books into the festival and conference. I understand why Colonel Halt didn't want to schlep a box full of books around. The skeptics all came out from under their rocks to say that the Colonel and all the airmen were looking at light from the lighthouse. Well, the Colonel knew where the lighthouse was, and he referenced it while they were looking at the weird lights in the woods. Also, the men in the control tower had been watching the lights in the woods, not just with binoculars, but with the radar scopes as well. The men were all told they saw nothing, and all the tapes were taken away by those guys in suits who showed up, trying to make the incident go away. Just about everyone who's on duty at the base on December 26th and 27th saw something in the woods flying over the base. It sounds as if the men in the suits were actually the men in black sent to tell everyone to shut up and stop making waves. Well, Colonel Halt said there had been one more UFO incident that tied in with the December 26th, 27th nights. A female police officer had seen a light in the forest and went to investigate. In the 1980s, if a woman was going to work in law enforcement, especially on an air base, she'd better be one tough person. The other airmen would give each other a hard time, and it would be even harder on a female. She was considered to be quite tough and responsible. Once she was off base and well into the woods, she ran into something that I guess you could say got the better of her. She began screaming into the radio. The base crew ran to her assistance, and she was put in the hospital and then shipped out of England and back to the United States. Kind of kept away from everybody else so she couldn't talk. Today, she lives in Italy and refuses to speak to anybody about what she ran into outside of the base that night. Like I said, I am not going to give the entire Bentwaters incident on this show simply because I would like to get Colonel Halt on and let him tell the story. Lacking in that, I will buy his book, read it, and give a one-sided perspective of it. I'm sure it's an excellent book to read, just talking to the Colonel. The way he spoke, the way he described things, it was fascinating. Maybe in a couple of months when I run out of other things to read. Once again, I'd like to give a big shout out to the folks involved at the conference. Noe Torres, Leti Leja, Magdiel Castillo, Soledad Nunez, and Daniel Allen Jones. They all did an excellent and an outstanding job. If you've never been to the Edinburg UFO Conference, set plans for next year, April of 2020. I'm sure it's going to be better than it was this year. I hope you enjoyed the show tonight. It is one thing to hear about something like this, but you really should try to attend in person. You see these folks on TV, but to meet them in person is far more impressive. Also, the stories they tell have special meaning when you hear it from them on stage. Tell your friends to listen up. I can always use the extra audience. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Dang it. Now it won't stop. Great, now I've got dead air time going out over the... because I can't get the thing to quit.